You're nothing but trash." The words hit Tanya Davis like a slap to the face, a punch that reverberated through her soul, even though no physical blow had landed. Jonathan Williams, the billionaire CEO of a tech empire, said those words as if they were nothing, just another insult thrown carelessly, a casual remark that meant so little to him. But to Tanya, they meant everything. The words seemed to echo in the extravagant dining room of the Veritas Lounge, an upscale restaurant where the elite of San Francisco gathered to show off their power, their wealth, their superiority. The chandeliers above gleamed with a cold light, their crystals catching every flicker of movement, every expression of contempt that passed between Jonathan and Tanya. Tanya had been a waitress at Veritas for over a year, but no matter how many times she served the city's most powerful men, there was always one thing she couldn't escape: how they looked at her. She was invisible. To them, she was just another employee, another face in the sea of black uniforms and white aprons. But tonight, Tanya wasn't just serving drinks and clearing plates. No, tonight, she was standing at the epicenter of a storm that had been building for months, years even. Jonathan Williams, tall and handsome with a tailored suit that cost more than Tanya's rent, leaned back in his chair with a smug grin, his eyes glinting with superiority. His voice, deep and confident, carried across the room. "You'll never belong here, Tanya," he said, sneering as he watched her pour wine into his glass. "You're nothing but trash." The words stung more than he realized. Tanya stood frozen for a moment, her hand still holding the wine bottle, her breath steady, but her mind racing. The room seemed to blur around her, the clinking of silverware and low chatter fading into the background. She had heard these kinds of things before, whispers behind her back, the knowing glances, the laughs that weren't meant for her. But tonight, she wasn't going to let it slide. She had been through too much, fought too hard, and stayed silent for too long. Tanya wasn't just another waitress. She had built this place from the ground up, a silent partner in its success, a crucial piece of the puzzle no one saw. The restaurant's success wasn't just thanks to the flashy menus and Michelin stars. It was thanks to Tanya's behind-the-scenes knowledge, her connections, and her sharp instincts. As Jonathan continued to talk, dismissing her as nothing more than a servant, Tanya let the moment wash over her. Her heart raced, not in fear, but in anticipation. She wasn't going to take it anymore. The bottle of wine in her hand felt heavier now, not because it was full, but because it was a symbol of everything she had endured, everything she had built while hiding in plain sight. Tension in the room was palpable. Jonathan Williams sat back in his chair, his arms crossed, the smug look on his face never wavering. He believed he had the upper hand, that his wealth and status made him untouchable. But Tanya Davis wasn't like the other people he had dismissed, and she was far from ordinary. Moment to collect herself. Her hand was still resting on the table where she had placed the wine bottle, and her fingers tightened ever so slightly around the neck of the bottle. Her thoughts focused on the decision she had made. She had waited for this moment, and now that it was here, she knew exactly what she had to do. Tanya had already spoken to the other silent partners, the ones who had been with her from the beginning. They had all agreed on the same course of action. Jonathan was no longer needed. He had played his part, but now it was time for him to step aside. The other partners had made their move, pulling strings from the shadows to make sure that Jonathan's influence over the restaurant would soon be a thing of the past. As she stood there, Tanya took a deep breath. The time for silence was over. It was time for Jonathan to realize that the game had changed. She wasn't going to be ignored any longer. The wine bottle in her hand was a symbol of her power, of the control she had long held over this establishment. And now, as Jonathan continued to bask in his delusion of dominance, Tanya's moment of reckoning was about to arrive. Slowly, Tanya turned away from the table, her movements smooth and deliberate. She reached for her phone and, without a second thought, made a call. The wheels were in motion, and soon, Jonathan would find out just how little control he really had. When she turned back to face him, her expression was calm, her demeanor cool, but the fire in her eyes was unmistakable. Jonathan's smile faltered for the first time as he sensed a shift in the air, a subtle change he couldn't put his finger on. Tanya was no longer the invisible servant he had thought she was. She was the one in charge now, and he had no idea what was coming. She walked over to the bar, her movements purposeful as she relayed a few quiet words to the bartender. It wasn't long before the first ripple in Jonathan's world began to show. He didn't notice it yet, but the walls he had so carefully built around himself were beginning to crumble. Tanya was more than just a waitress. She was the key to everything Jonathan had worked so hard to build, and the one person who had the power to destroy it all. Jonathan's eyes narrowed as Tanya walked back toward the table, her calm demeanor betraying nothing of the storm that was quietly brewing underneath. The room still buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses, but for Jonathan, everything felt off. He had spent years at the top, building his empire, controlling everything and everyone around him. But now, something was different. He could feel it in the air, a shift he couldn't explain. Tanya had never been anything more than a face in the crowd, a waitress who served food and poured drinks. But now, as she approached him with a steady, purposeful stride, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer invisible. His mind raced, trying to figure out what was happening. He dismissed it at first. She was just a server, nothing more. But as she stopped in front of him, her gaze unwavering, Jonathan's confidence wavered. He had dismissed her for so long, had called her trash, assuming she was nothing more than a cog in the machine, a pawn in his game. But in that moment, he realized that he had underestimated her. And he couldn't have been more wrong. Tanya stood still for a moment, letting the silence hang in the air. The weight of her presence was undeniable, and Jonathan felt the tension in his chest tighten. He had been the one in control for so long, the one who made the decisions, the one who dictated the rules. But now, as he looked at Tanya, it was as if he was seeing her for the first time. Tanya's expression was calm, but her eyes, dark and knowing, told a different story. She had spent years building something he could never understand. She had been the one who knew the true power of relationships, of trust, of quiet influence. She had watched him, studied him, and understood exactly how to play the game. Jonathan had thought he was the one pulling the strings, but now, as Tanya's eyes met his, he realized the truth. She had been in control all along. It wasn't about the money or the power he wielded. It was about the people behind the scenes, the ones who didn't need to flaunt their wealth to command respect. And Tanya was one of those people. As the realization sank in, Jonathan's mind flashed back to the earlier conversation, the words he had spoken without thinking. "You're nothing but trash." The words echoed in his mind now, a cruel reminder of how blind he had been. Tanya wasn't just a waitress. She was the silent partner, the unseen force that had been shaping the destiny of Veritas Lounge long before he even stepped foot inside. And now, she was about to show him just how much power she truly had. Tanya took a deep breath, her gaze never leaving Jonathan's. She didn't need to say anything more. She had made her point. The room seemed to hold its breath as she turned, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she walked toward the back office. Jonathan didn't move at first, his mind still trying to process what had just happened. He had always prided himself on being able to read people, on knowing exactly how to manipulate a situation to his advantage. But Tanya had flipped the script. He had never seen it coming. As Tanya reached the door to the office, she paused for just a moment, her back still turned to Jonathan. Without looking at him, she spoke softly, her voice carrying across the room. "The deal is done," she said, her words deliberate, each one hitting with the weight of a hammer. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat as the realization hit him like a freight train. "What deal?" he asked, his voice tight. Tanya didn't turn around. "You'll find out soon enough," she replied, her tone calm, almost as if she were simply stating a fact. And with that, she stepped through the door, leaving Jonathan in stunned silence. The room was still, the laughter and conversation continuing around him, but for Jonathan, everything had changed. The power he had once held so firmly in his grasp was slipping away, and he didn't know how to stop it. He had underestimated Tanya, and now, he was about to pay the price. The silence in the room felt suffocating as Jonathan remained frozen in his seat, his mind racing to process what had just occurred. Tanya had walked out of the room, her quiet confidence leaving him in a state of confusion and disbelief. He had always prided himself on his ability to control situations, on his sharp business mind. But now, as he sat there alone, he realized he had completely misjudged her. Tanya was no ordinary waitress. She wasn't just a cog in the machine, a background figure who catered to his every whim. She was someone far more powerful than he had ever imagined. Jonathan's thoughts swirled as he tried to regain his composure. He had dismissed her, insulted her, and assumed she was beneath him. And now, she was the one holding all the cards. The reality of the situation hit him hard. Tanya was the silent partner of Veritas Lounge, the one who had made the crucial decisions behind the scenes, the one who had orchestrated every deal, every negotiation. The very place he had once believed he controlled had actually been in her hands all along. Jonathan clenched his fists, the anger building inside him. How had he not seen it? How had he let his arrogance blind him to the truth? He thought about the countless times he had spoken down to Tanya, the way he had belittled her in front of others, treating her as if she were nothing more than an invisible servant. And now, he was left to face the consequences of his own ignorance. As he sat there, stewing in his frustration, a sense of unease settled over him. He needed answers, but he didn't know where to turn. His usual channels of control, his powerful network of connections, suddenly felt useless. The walls he had carefully built around himself were crumbling, and he didn't know how to stop it. Tanya had outplayed him. He could feel it in his gut. She had been playing the long game, building something he could never have imagined, and now, it was too late to stop her. The sound of his phone buzzing on the table jolted him out of his thoughts. He reached for it, his hands shaking slightly as he unlocked the screen. It was an email, one he hadn't expected to receive. The subject line read, Veritas Lounge Sale, Immediate Action Required. His heart skipped a beat as he opened the email, the contents quickly confirming his worst fear. Tanya had sold her shares in the restaurant to a competing group, a group that had been quietly buying up key positions within the business. The deal had been finalized, and Jonathan was no longer in control. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. Everything he had worked for, everything he had fought to build, was slipping through his fingers. Tanya had executed the perfect coup, and he had no one to blame but himself. He had been too arrogant, too quick to dismiss her. And now, it was too late to make amends. Jonathan's mind raced, but there was no escaping the truth. Tanya had won, and he had lost. His empire, the one he had spent years constructing, was now in the hands of people who knew how to play the game in ways he had never understood. He had thought his wealth and influence would protect him, but it hadn't. All of his power, all of his status, had amounted to nothing in the face of Tanya's quiet, calculated brilliance. As the weight of the situation settled over him, Jonathan realized he was no longer the man in charge. Tanya was, and there was nothing he could do to change that. He had been so sure of himself, so certain that nothing could shake his dominance. But in the end, it was Tanya who had outsmarted him, who had patiently waited for the perfect moment to strike. And now, as the reality of his defeat sank in, Jonathan was left with nothing but the bitter taste of regret. Jonathan sat there, staring at the email in disbelief, the words on the screen beginning to blur as his mind raced to process the reality of the situation. The deal had been finalized, and he was no longer the one in control of Veritas Lounge. He had spent years building his empire, using his wealth and influence to manipulate every situation, but it had all come crashing down in a matter of moments. Tanya had taken everything from him, and he had no one to blame but himself. The arrogance that had fueled his success had now led to his downfall. He had underestimated her, dismissed her as nothing more than a servant, a background figure who didn't matter. And now, she was the one holding the power. As the weight of the situation sank in, Jonathan felt a cold sweat forming on his forehead. He had always prided himself on being able to stay ahead of the competition, to outsmart everyone around him. But Tanya had played the long game, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to strike. She had known exactly what she was doing, and now, she had orchestrated his defeat. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Veritas Lounge, the very restaurant he had built, was no longer his. It had been taken from him by the very person he had underestimated, the person he had called trash. He could feel his chest tighten as the anger and frustration bubbled up inside him. How had he let this happen? How had he not seen it? He had been so sure of his power, so confident in his ability to control every situation, but now he was powerless. Jonathan knew he couldn't just sit there and let this happen. He had to do something, anything, to take back control. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized there was nothing he could do. Tanya had already won. His mind went back to the moments he had shared with her, the way he had treated her with such disdain, the way he had belittled her in front of others. He had thought she was nothing more than a servant, someone to do his bidding. But in reality, she had been the one pulling the strings, making the decisions that had kept the restaurant afloat. She had been the one who knew the ins and outs of the business, who understood the real power dynamics at play. And now, as he sat there, alone in his office, Jonathan realized how deeply he had misjudged her. The thought of losing everything he had worked for was unbearable. He had always been in control, always the one making the decisions, always the one calling the shots. But now, that control was slipping through his fingers like sand. Tanya had taken it all, and there was nothing he could do to stop her. As the realization settled in, Jonathan felt a wave of panic wash over him. What was he supposed to do now? How could he face his investors, his employees, the people who had once looked up to him? He had built his reputation on being ruthless, on never backing down. But now he was facing the consequences of his own actions. The thought of having to admit defeat was almost too much to bear. He had been so focused on building his empire, on amassing wealth and power, that he had forgotten the most important lesson: respect. He had treated Tanya as if she were beneath him, and now she was the one who had shown him what true power looked like. Tanya had never needed to prove herself to him. She had always known her worth, even if he had never seen it. And now, as he sat there in his office, his empire crumbling around him, Jonathan realized that the only thing left for him was to accept his defeat. He had lost, and there was no way to get it back. The anger and frustration that had once fueled him now felt hollow, meaningless. In the end, it wasn't about wealth or power. It was about respect, and Jonathan had lost that the moment he dismissed Tanya as trash. The days following the collapse of Jonathan's control over Veritas Lounge felt like an endless weight pressing down on him. He sat in his office, the once familiar space now feeling like a cage, the walls closing in as his mind replayed every mistake, every miscalculation. Tanya's quiet power had shattered him in ways he hadn't expected. He had always prided himself on being a master of the game, a businessman who could manipulate any situation, but Tanya had shown him the truth. True power didn't come from wealth or status. It came from the unseen, from the relationships built in silence, from the quiet strength that operated from the shadows. Jonathan had thought his money, his influence, would protect him. He had believed that no one could touch him, not with the empire he had built. But now, sitting alone in his office, the reality was undeniable. He had lost everything, and there was no one to blame but himself. He had taken Tanya for granted, dismissed her as nothing more than a waitress. He had mocked her, belittled her, and thought that his power would always be unshakable. But he had underestimated her, and in doing so, he had lost it all. The phone on his desk buzzed, the sharp sound cutting through the silence like a jolt of electricity. Jonathan picked it up slowly, the weight of the moment settling deeper into his chest. It was an email, one that confirmed what he already knew. His investors were pulling out. The people who had once trusted him, who had believed in his vision, were now distancing themselves, leaving him with nothing. The feeling of helplessness washed over him as he read the email, the cold reality of his situation sinking in. The loss wasn't just financial. It was personal. The respect he had built up over the years had evaporated, replaced by the sharp sting of failure. Jonathan had always believed that respect could be bought, that power could be wielded with enough money and influence. But Tanya had proven him wrong. She had shown him that respect was earned, not purchased. She had earned the respect of those around her, not through grand gestures, but through quiet determination, through building something meaningful from the ground up. As Jonathan sat there, the weight of his failure crushing him, he couldn't help but think about Tanya. She had been the one person who had never been intimidated by him, never cowed by his wealth or his status. She had stood her ground, silently watching as he made mistake after mistake, and when the time came, she had struck. She had taken everything from him, and she had done it with nothing more than patience and quiet strength. Tanya had taught him a lesson he would never forget. Power wasn't about dominance, it was about resilience. It was about knowing when to be quiet and when to act, about understanding the value of patience and timing. She had bided her time, waiting for the moment when Jonathan's arrogance would be his downfall, and when that moment arrived, she had seized it without hesitation. Jonathan's phone buzzed again, interrupting his thoughts. This time, it was a message from his lawyer. A meeting was scheduled for the next morning to discuss the future of Veritas Lounge. But Jonathan knew that it was no longer his to control. Tanya had made sure of that. She had taken the reins, and now, he was left to face the consequences of his actions. The anger that had once burned inside him now felt hollow, the fire extinguished by the realization that he had lost everything. He had spent so long building his empire, but in the end, it was Tanya who had emerged victorious. She had outsmarted him, outmaneuvered him, and in the end, she had taken everything that had once been his. As Jonathan sat there, staring at the empty room around him, the weight of his loss settled in. He had underestimated her, and now, he had nothing left. The empire he had spent years building was no more, and it was all because of one mistake. He had thought he was invincible, but Tanya had shown him the truth. No one was invincible, and now, Jonathan had to face the reality of his defeat. Jonathan walked into the meeting the next morning with his head held low, the weight of the previous days crushing his every step. The luxurious conference room, once a place where he had held the power to make deals and command respect, now felt cold and unfamiliar. He had arrived early, hoping for some miracle, a twist of fate that would somehow change the course of his downward spiral. But deep down, he knew there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. The walls of the room, with their gleaming surfaces and sharp, minimalist decor, seemed to close in on him as he took a seat at the large oak table. He could feel the eyes of the lawyers and investors on him as they filed in, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disappointment. His reputation had crumbled overnight, and there was nothing left to salvage. Tanya had won. She had taken control of Veritas Lounge, and Jonathan was left with nothing but the remnants of his empire. The lawyer sitting across from him, a woman with sharp features and an even sharper gaze, cleared her throat and slid a file across the table toward him. Jonathan looked at it, but he couldn't bring himself to touch it. He had been handed his fate, and now he had to face it. "Mr. Williams," she began, her voice crisp and professional. "As you are aware, the restaurant's ownership has officially changed hands. The new management team will be taking over operations immediately. There are a few legal matters we need to finalize today regarding your exit." Jonathan nodded silently, his mind elsewhere. He had worked tirelessly to build Veritas Lounge into the prestigious establishment it had become. It had been his vision, his dream, and now it was slipping away. The room felt like a prison. "You'll receive your severance package," the lawyer continued. "But in terms of your role with the business moving forward, there will be no further involvement. The terms are non-negotiable." Jonathan's gaze drifted to the floor, the reality of his loss settling in. He had nothing left. No restaurant, no position, no power. The people around him, the investors, the partners, had all turned their backs. In the end, it wasn't the competition or the economy that had taken him down. It had been his own arrogance, his refusal to see the value in those he deemed beneath him. Tanya had seen the bigger picture, played the long game, and now she was reaping the rewards. She had built relationships in the shadows, made strategic moves without ever revealing her true role. She had known exactly how to manipulate the system, and Jonathan had never even suspected it. His phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw a text message from an unknown number. His fingers trembled as he unlocked the phone, the message sending a chill down his spine. "Tanya's waiting for you at Veritas. She's going to give you a chance to say goodbye." The message was brief, but it carried a weight that Jonathan couldn't ignore. Tanya was giving him one last opportunity to face her, to acknowledge the truth of what had happened. He had no choice but to go. As he stood up, the weight of the moment seemed to press down even harder. He wasn't sure what to expect when he walked into the restaurant, but he knew that this was his last chance to make things right. But deep down, he knew that the damage had already been done. There was no going back. He had treated Tanya with nothing but contempt, and now she had taken everything from him. As he left the conference room, his mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Tanya had beaten him at his own game, but she had done it with grace and patience. She had earned her victory, and he had earned his defeat. There was no escaping the reality of it. As Jonathan made his way to Veritas Lounge, he couldn't help but wonder what Tanya would say to him. Would she offer him some kind of redemption? Or would she simply remind him of how wrong he had been? Either way, He knew it was too late for apologies. Tanya had played him, and he had lost. There was no coming back from that. Jonathan walked into Veritas' lounge with the heavy weight of his defeat hanging over him. The familiar clinking of glasses and the soft hum of conversation filled the air, but to him, the sounds felt distant, as if they were part of a life he no longer recognized. He had walked this floor countless times before, confident in his place at the top. But now, everything felt different. The room seemed colder, the walls pressing in on him, reminding him of everything he had lost. As he approached the bar, he could see Tanya standing in the distance, her back to him as she spoke with the bartender. She didn't turn to acknowledge him, but Jonathan could feel the weight of her presence, a presence that seemed to fill the entire room. She had been so quiet, so patient, but in that silence, she had become the most powerful person in the room. Jonathan swallowed hard as he walked toward her, his heart racing. He had thought that his wealth and status would always shield him, but Tanya had proven him wrong. She had been the one in control all along, and he had failed to see it until it was too late. Tanya turned to face him as he approached, her expression calm, almost serene. She looked every bit the part of the successful businesswoman she was, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that Jonathan couldn't ignore. She was no longer the waitress he had dismissed, the woman he had mocked. She was the one who had taken everything from him, and he knew that now. "You wanted to see me," Tanya said, her voice steady and even. There was no anger in her tone, no bitterness, just a quiet certainty that spoke volumes. Jonathan hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. He had been so certain of his own superiority, so sure that he was untouchable, but now all of that confidence had evaporated. He had nothing left to cling to. I didn't expect this," Jonathan finally said, his voice faltering slightly. "I didn't think it would end like this." Tanya's gaze didn't waver. "You never saw me," she replied softly, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "You never bothered to see who I really was. You were too busy thinking you could control everything, thinking that power was something you could hold in your hand and never let go." Jonathan opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He had no defense, no explanation that could justify his actions. He had thought of Tanya as nothing more than a tool, someone to be used and discarded when he no longer had a need for her. But now, as he stood there in front of her, he realized how wrong he had been. "I don't want your apology," Tanya continued, her voice still calm but firm. "I don't need it. What I've done here, I did because it was right, not because I wanted your approval." Jonathan felt the sting of her words, but there was no anger behind them, only the quiet weight of truth. He had always been the one in control, the one who made the rules, but Tanya had shown him a different kind of power, a power that came not from wealth or influence, but from patience, from knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. "I've already won," Tanya said, her tone unwavering. "Not because I took something from you, but because I built something you could never understand. And now, it's time for you to walk away." Jonathan's heart sank as the reality of the situation settled in. He had nothing left. His empire was gone, and there was no coming back from this. Tanya had played him, outsmarted him, and in the end, she had taken everything from him. He had nothing left to cling to but the bitter taste of his own failure. Tanya turned away, her attention shifting back to the bartender, as if the conversation had ended. Jonathan stood there for a moment, taking in the weight of her words, the gravity of the situation. He had lost, and there was no way to undo it. As he turned to leave, he realized that he wasn't just walking out of the restaurant. He was walking away from the life he had built, from the world where he had been king. And in its place, Tanya had risen. He had lost everything, and she had gained it all. The moment felt final, like the closing of a chapter he could never return to. As he stepped out of Veritas' lounge and into the night, the world felt different. It was no longer his to control, and he realized, with a painful clarity, that it never had been. Jonathan stood outside Veritas' lounge, the doors slowly closing behind him, the weight of everything he had lost pressing down on him like a physical force. The bustling streets of San Francisco felt distant now, as if he were on the edge of a world that no longer had any place for him. His empire, his wealth, his status, they had all slipped through his fingers, leaving him empty-handed. He had always believed that control was the key to everything, that with enough power, enough money, enough influence, he could make the world bend to his will. But now, standing there in the cool night air, he realized how wrong he had been. He had spent his life building an empire, brick by brick, stacking his wealth and influence on top of one another until it reached towering heights. But in the end, it wasn't the money or the power that mattered. It was respect. And Tanya had shown him what true respect looked like: quiet, patient, and unwavering. She had never needed to flaunt her success. She had never needed to be the loudest person in the room. She had understood something that Jonathan had never bothered to learn. Real power didn't come from taking everything for yourself. It came from building something meaningful, from understanding people, from earning their trust. As he walked away from the restaurant, Jonathan couldn't help but replay the events in his mind. He had dismissed Tanya, underestimated her at every turn. He had thought she was just another employee, someone to serve him, to cater to his every whim. But she had been the one in control all along, the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. He had been too blinded by his own ego to see it. And now, there was nothing left. No wealth, no empire, no respect. His phone buzzed again, a notification from his lawyer. The message was brief: "The deal is done. You no longer have any stake in Veritas Lounge." Jonathan had known it was coming, but hearing it out loud made the loss feel all the more final. The restaurant he had built, the business that had once defined him, was no longer his. It was hers. Tanya had taken everything from him, and he couldn't stop it. He thought about going back, about trying to fight for control, but deep down, he knew it was pointless. The battle was over, and he had lost. Tanya had already won, and there was nothing he could do to change that. The streets felt colder as he walked, the city lights flickering overhead like distant stars in a sky that no longer held any meaning for him. He had spent so much of his life chasing after power, after success, and now it all felt so hollow. He thought about the moments he had spent with Tanya, the way he had treated her like she was nothing. And now, as he walked away from the restaurant that had once been his, he realized how much he had underestimated her. Tanya had built something that could never be taken away. She had earned her place, not through manipulation or force, but through quiet strength and patience. She had waited for the right moment to strike, and when it came, she had taken everything without hesitation. Jonathan's footsteps slowed as he reached the corner, the weight of the night settling in his chest. He had lost it all, and now he had to face the reality of what that meant. There was no going back. He couldn't fix what had been broken. He had spent so much of his life thinking that he was untouchable, that nothing could tear him down. But now, standing alone on the street corner, he realized that the true cost of his arrogance was more than he could ever have imagined. He had underestimated Tanya, and now he was paying the price. The world was moving on without him, and he was left behind, a man whose empire had crumbled, a man who had been undone by his own pride. As he looked up at the city skyline, the lights twinkling in the distance, he knew that his life would never be the same. Tanya had taken everything from him, and he would never be able to rebuild what he had lost. The silence of the night seemed to swallow him whole, and for the first time, Jonathan felt truly alone.